conference really was curated by an excellent, loving, and devoted team who are not only great MUNers, but also like good friends and team to each other. I think you will see that throughout the conference. And I want to wish everyone a really, really excellent Model UN experience. Have a great IOMUN 7, everyone.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this very touching and important reflection. Next up, we have our guest speaker, Ambassador Cynthia P Schneider. Dr. Cynthia P Schneider teaches, publishes, and speaks about the importance of culture in diplomacy and international affairs, while putting these ideas into practice everywhere from war zones to Hollywood writers' rooms. As US ambassador to the Netherlands, she led initiatives in public and cultural diplomacy, biotechnology, cybersecurity, and military relationships and sales. At Georgetown, Professor Schneider teaches in the School of Foreign Service and co-directs the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, an interdisciplinary initiative with the goal of humanizing global politics through the power of performance. From 1984 to 2004, she taught art history at Georgetown and wrote books and organized museum exhibitions on Rembrandt and 17th century Dutch art. Dr. Schneider co-directs the Timbuktu Renaissance, a Mali-based platform for countering extremism and building peace and sustainable development through a focus on culture, which grew out of her work leading the Arts and Culture Dialogue Initiative at the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy. She also co-directs the Los Angeles-based Muslims on Screen and Television Most resource, which works with TV and film writers and producers to develop authentic and nuanced characters and plots involving Muslims and Muslim-majority regions. Professor Schneider has published on current issues in popular and policy outlets, such as USA Today, Los Angeles Times, CNN, Foreign Policy, Business Insider, Huffington Post, among others, and has spoken around the world on topics involving foreign policy and politics and culture, including at TED. Her current book in progress is titled Culture on the Front Lines, 21st Century Diplomacy. Ambassador Schneider has a Bachelor of Arts and a Doctorate of Philosophy from Harvard University. Dr. Schneider, thank you so much for coming, and I will stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. Thank you, Dr. Schneider, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Alonso, and all of the co-secretary generals. I think this is a model that perhaps the actual UN might think of adopting. Maybe somehow there might be a woman in charge eventually if they would. I want to thank you all for inviting me to join you today. It's a real honor for me. It's so exciting to think that I am talking with, and I do think it's with, not to, all of these young people all over the world interested in international relations. Now, I'm going to be speaking from a, whoops, I'm just going to try to advance here. Yeah, I'm going to be speaking from an American perspective, but I hope it will also be a kind of global perspective, but I really welcome your comments and questions from your own perspectives. And I'm going to warn you, I'm going to try to shake things up a little bit. I'm going to try to get you to maybe look at the world in a slightly different way or from a different lens than you might have been taught to do. And this is going to be through a focus on culture. And let's begin with Afghanistan. I'm showing you here images representing two things that took place 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago today, both kind of seminal events in Afghanistan. On the left, you see Zahra Elam. She was the first female winner of the extremely popular television program, Afghan Star. Afghan Star, as you might guess, is modeled after American Idol, as many, many programs around the world are. And I think that this program both reflects and really demonstrates changes in Afghan society and actually realizes them in real life. because Afghan Star is a lot more than just a singing contest. Afghan Star is a meritocracy. That's a very rare thing, I'm sorry to say, in Afghanistan. And by that, I mean, in Afghan Star, which works very much the way American Idol does, the independent television show that entity that produces it, Moby Media, part of the thriving independent media sector in Afghanistan. They go around the country, people try out, from their communities, and gradually you move up to the finals. The winners are chosen by voting, but the winners succeed not by their family connections or their ethnic connections or the money their family has. They succeed purely on their own talent. And that is, as I said, a rare thing in Afghanistan and in many parts of the world. It's an interesting thing to contemplate. What if the United States and other countries who promote democracy had focused on meritocracy more than pure democracy, which sometimes falsely can be translated into voting, which, as I'm sure you know, doesn't mean democracy. Meritocracy means real societal change. And Afghan Star shows that to you. A third of the country votes in the finals. This show has brought Afghan music back to life. As you remember, the Taliban banned music altogether in the 1990s. Music is incredibly important in Afghanistan. They tell their stories through music. People grow up knowing the same songs. In Afghan Star, they sing all Afghan music. It's not American at all. So you have a third of the country watching the finals, voting in the finals. And this year, for the very first time, they voted a woman the winner. This is an 18-year-old young woman from the Hazara minority who lives in a Taliban-controlled province. So, what does that say about that country and where that country is at that time? At the very same moment, the United States government began negotiations with the people you see on the right, all male representatives of a terrorist group. And after years and years of fighting in Afghanistan, how does the United States choose to end that conflict? By negotiating with terrorists, not even including the Afghan government. And what were we negotiating? We were negotiating, and tell me, please, someone, why we should trust a terrorist group to deliver on a promise. We were negotiating. The terms were that the Taliban would guarantee that they would not harbor international terrorists in the country, and that they would not attack American troops. It just has nothing to do, actually, with the Afghan people. So what kind of global leadership is that? And which country is this? Is Afghanistan the country of terrorism, which then Taliban does control about a third of the country now? Or is it the country where millions of people vote for this young woman to win this hugely popular contest? And this story goes on. You may have seen in the news recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a minister of education, I'm very sorry to say a female minister of education, in Kabul issued a ban on young women over the age of 12 singing in public. Well, there was a huge backlash, a huge public backlash against it. And the man you see here launched the viral I Am My Song campaign. And eventually the government had to rescind, and they were very embarrassed and said, oh, we didn't really mean it. We didn't really want to do that. Well, that's because, not just this man, Ahmed Sarmast, who founded the Afghan National Institute of Music, which has this extraordinary all-female orchestra. You see him with here, the orchestra called Zora, and they perform all over the world, including in the World Economic Forum and many places. Not just Dr. Sarmast and his students at the Afghan National Institute of Music, but people all over the country responded and said, no, you are not going to silence women's voices. Again, that will not happen. So another affirmation of what the Afghan people want. And I would put to you that the United States government, which is currently reevaluating the whole negotiating with the Taliban deal, should be listening to the voices of the people of Afghanistan, which we hear through these cultural outlets. It's also important from a security perspective to listen to the voices of culture. It was, in fact, cultural voices, whether through rappers like the Tunisian El General, or through books, or through music, through film. That's where the clues to the Arab Spring were. But in government and policymakers traditionally don't listen to those voices. And so when the Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia in December of 2010, they were taken by surprise. You see here on the left, President Bush shaking hands with Ben Ali, who was the dictator in Tunisia. Now, we'd had diplomats there, as many other countries had. We knew that he was a corrupt, ineffective, authoritarian dictator. That wasn't like a huge surprise. But what we didn't know was the extent of the discontent, just how miserable people were and how they really were at their breaking point. And that state of misery was captured in the lyrics of El General, and it was actually his arrest by Ben Ali in the very early days of the revolution that led to thousands of people coming into the streets, which led to more people coming into the streets, which broke out in a revolution, which eventually cascaded into revolutions in Egypt, Syria, and Libya. So, as well as other ripple movements in other parts of the Middle East. So think about it. You know, here's this one young guy who's a rapper, and look what happened when he was arrested. And I'm going to look at this a little bit more closely because this is a global movement. You have now, and have had for the last 6 months or so, demonstrations in Thailand against the military dictatorship there. Which took over in 2014, and the group Rap Against Dictatorship has been a seminal force in the protests going on in Thailand. And I want you to compare the lyrics of El General in Tunisia in 2010 and the lyrics of Rap Against Dictatorship in Thailand in 2020. There are real similarities there. You know, they're not saying we want a democratic system, we want to vote, no, they're saying we are miserable. You are not allowing us to live our life. And in Thailand in particular, they're speaking out against corruption and squandering of money by not just the government, but also the monarchy, which is that they have crossed a red line. There had never been criticism of the Thai monarchy before, and now that is happening. And members of Rap Against Dictatorship have been arrested and held, but then released. So they continue. This is their song Reform, which was released fairly recently. So, and I, as an American, have to say this music, this rap music, of course, like jazz, originated in the United States. It originated in New York City in the late 70s, early 80s, as a music of protest, as a music of discontent, as a music of people protesting against authority. And I'm not talking about, you know, all the bling and everything else that comes with successful rappers today all over the world. And, you know, good for them. But what people gravitate towards and what people are inspired by all around the world is really the political rap of the 80s and 90s. That's what they go back to, and that's what they take as an inspiration and then translate into their own language. Literally, these are translations of the lyrics. They don't come out in English, they came out in Arabic and Thai. translate it into their own situation and use it to protest oppression in their location. Now, and you saw in the, may have seen in the reference in the lyrics of Rap Against Democracy to the 3-finger salute. This, I'm sure you all recognize from Hunger Games. This is being used in protests all over the world. You know, just a subtle example of soft power, you know, of the influence of these series of books and then turned into films that, you know, certainly weren't written to fuel revolutions, but it's a story that resonates with people. And that's the power of culture, stories and emotional connection. And it's a very strange thing in policymaking, particularly foreign policymaking, that nobody makes use of stories. Now, that is a distinct feature of human beings compared to other species. We live through stories. We live by stories. That's how we communicate. And yet, in my view, foreign policy leaves this very essential tool on the table. So here you have people inspired all over Asia with this 3-finger salute. You see it projected on a building there in Myanmar. People are using it in the protests in Myanmar. And, you know, you hear a lot about the spread of authoritarianism around the world. That's happening at the top level of governments. Yes, that is true. I just talked about the military dictatorship that took over in Thailand. Military dictatorship just took over in Myanmar. I am not denying that this is absolutely happening, unfortunately. But at the same time, at the next level, at the level of the people, there's also a global movement towards democracy and human rights. And these young people, and that's the other connecting theme, that's why I'm so thrilled to be talking to you guys, it is the majority youthful populations around the world, whether they're in Tunisia or whether they're in Myanmar, or whether they're in Thailand, who are saying, no, we're not going to take it anymore. This may have been okay for you, my parents and grandparents. It's not okay for me. And I'm willing to risk my life for it. And they're exchanging information, they're exchanging techniques, they're exchanging strategies. They're using the internet incredibly creatively. You know, I just discovered this site, Culture Hub, that someone invited me to join. But that had been a place where Chinese people could gather and talk about the genocide of the Uyghurs. You can't talk about that in China. They were talking about it on Culture Hub, on the Chinese version of Culture Hub, until the Chinese government shut it down. But they'll figure out a workaround. They'll figure out another way. So, you know, this is, to me, very exciting and moving, this global movement towards democracy. It's happening beneath the levels of power for now, but I think not forever. Another important capacity of culture is its ability to move and unite people, to heal and reconcile in the wake of conflict. And this is something that I've seen firsthand personally in my work in Mali for the Timbuktu Renaissance. You may remember that Mali was invaded by al-Qaeda linked extremists in 2012. The whole northern half of the country, including Timbuktu, a great historic center of civilization, was occupied. And one of the things that these extremists did, like the Taliban, they banned music. Well, music in Mali, again, I don't know if you know this, but music in Mali, it's like the internet. It's the way people communicate, past, present, visions for the future. Mali is a significantly illiterate society, so this is really important. Mali is also the root of blues and rock and roll. That's where this music began, transported against their will to the United States through slavery and slaves to the southern United States, and where the rhythms of music from West Africa, particularly Mali, planted the seeds for the blues first, which is the roots of rock and roll. So Malian music is known all over the world, but it's also really important inside the country. And so when in 2014, I, together with Malian colleagues and one other American, formed the Timbuktu Renaissance, our goal for helping to bring peace and reconciliation back to Timbuktu and in the wake of all of the distrust and division and ongoing violence after the occupation, our plan was to organize public concerts. Now, that might not seem like the most obvious way to bring peace, but in Timbuktu, it was, because everyone would come out to the concerts. And so we're funded by NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, not a cultural organization, but an organization that recognizes the power of culture in this context. So everyone would come out to the concerts, all different ethnic groups, all different backgrounds, dance together, enjoy the music together, start talking together. And that did, in fact, heal a lot of the divisions. And when violence flared up about a year and a half ago, the mayor of Timbuktu called my Malian colleague and said, "We need you to organize a concert. We've got to tamp this down before it spreads further." And that's what you're seeing here. And about 2,000 people came to this outdoor concert, were there for hours, and there hasn't been any violence since. Now, this doesn't solve all of Timbuktu's problems. There's a desperate need for economic development. Timbuktu lived off tourism. There are no tourists now because there's still ongoing violence for a whole lot of bigger reasons. But on a person-to-person basis, this cultural experience is what brought people together. Interestingly, I think that extremists and authoritarians, much more than good guys trying to promote human rights and democracy, it's extremists and authoritarians who recognize the power of culture. And they see the threat it poses to their fundamentalist perspective, whether it's Islamic or whether it's the Khmer Rouge. It doesn't matter the background. And so they very often, Hitler, whoever, you name it, they want to impose a straight line of history that justifies their existence. And they want to get rid of anything that gets in the way. Example was the terrible bombing of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. The Taliban wanted to impose a strict Islamic history on Afghanistan, which is simply not true. It was a great center of Buddhist civilization in Central Asia. But so when that got in the way, they just destroyed it. That's what ISIS did when in their brief reign of terror. And this is the terrible destruction of the ancient site of Palmyra. This is something that's been going on forever by conquerors. People in Mexico will recognize what the Spanish did when they invaded Mexico. And of course, it's what the Americans did when we settled America and destroyed Native American culture. And here you see the San Ildefonso Cathedral in Yucatan built literally on top of Mayan ruins. So this is something that the conquerors always have done. They recognize that in order to be able to rule, they have to eliminate the culture that went before them, because culture has the power to unite people, to give them strength, to give them a sense of purpose and identity. So ironically, in the 21st century, it's extremists and authoritarians who understand why culture matters. And I ask the question, why don't we? If you need to tear down and destroy culture in order to dominate, then why wouldn't you want to make the humanizing capacity of culture a central part of any kind of rebuilding and regeneration of societies. And I think you'll find if you look at any government really in the world, this is simply not true. Culture is always on the periphery. And I would submit to you that this is a mistake and that it has tremendous power to unite and inspire people. And I wish that it would be harnessed for those good purposes more than it is, because the people recognize this and they're using culture all over the world. It's just the people in authority that have to wake up to the humanizing capacity of culture. So I'll end there. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take your questions and comments, and I wish you really a great weekend at your conference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider. So if you want to ask any questions, please use the raise hand reaction. So feel free to just raise your hand, ask any questions that you might have for the ambassador, and she will answer them for you. Thank you, Alan.
Yes, thank you. So you have mentioned the importance of culture, and I fully agree in that regard. Being a philosophy student myself, I have not seen a holistic attempt at defining actually culture. So what do you believe would be the optimal approach in understanding what is culture?
Alan, would you mind telling me where you're from?
I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Oh, well, culture's been a big part of the
Definitely.
both division and reconciliation there, as I understand it. And actually, yeah, and ironically, I shouldn't say ironically, but anyway, in Belgrade is really one of the great centers that studies this. I'm blanking on his name, but anyway, it is. I've worked with those people. You know, Alan, I am so sorry, but I'm really not big on definitions. I feel like they exclude more than they encompass. So, I could spend all morning defining culture. I really think it is all forms of creative expression. And that can be, actual things like actual books, actual films, and it can also be food. It can be the way, what connects people that way. I think that more useful than trying to find a definition to me is looking at the way it works in societies and seeing, because it's definitely not a one size fits all situation. In Mali, music is what unites people. That's not true everywhere. And in another place, it could, or other societies are maybe more literary. Or it can be a performance and dance. That tends to be more true in Southeast Asia. So, it's really different in different places. And I think the most important thing is to observe and see what it is that really moves and unites people. And interestingly, there have been a number of books recently about the importance of culture, talking about anthropological culture, which is also very important. That's not my background, doesn't happen to be the particular thing I'm talking about, but there has been more recognition of that kind of societal aspect of culture and its importance. But ironically, at least in the United States, where we have this, which I've never understood why, but this strange kind of sense that anything creative is nice and good, and we'd like to go occasionally to see it, but it could never be central to policymaking. It's always on the side. That's less true, I think. I don't know, Alonso, if you have anything to add to this. It's less true in a country like Mexico, where art and various forms of art, visual art in particular, has been political, has a great tradition of political art. The United States doesn't. I'm not sure why. I'll just close by saying something. A friend of mine who runs a very effective organization for the empowerment of women, Vital Voices, said to me once when I asked her about this in the context of her work, she said, culture can be the problem in the sense of an anthropological, like a patriarchal culture like that exists in some parts of Afghanistan, for example. It can be the problem, but culture can also be the solution in the sense of creative culture and the creative voices that I've been showing you. Sorry.
Oh, yes, you can go ahead, Hosna. Thank you.
Yeah, Husni. So this is more so connecting to what you just said about culture sometimes being the problem or also being the solution. Do you think that if first I put us in a situation where there's complete peace between a lot of people, there's like lots of mixtures of cultures, would that make people give up their uniqueness of their cultures or the histories of their cultures and a want to have peace with other people's cultures? Does it make it very homogenous? I don't know if that's how you say that word. It's not my first language, sis. But if it ends up being super homogenous, like you put a few people from like a few different races, 100 years later, all the kids are going to be the exact same race or mixtures of so, would it be the exact same with cultures? And is that the reason why people don't really want to meet other people's cultures, maybe? I just want to like know your point of view over it.
I'll say, and I'd really be grateful if other people asking questions would do this. Would you just tell me where you're from and something about yourself, please?
I'm from my house, but more specifically, I'm from Israel. I saw everybody just roll their eyes. Sorry, I like dad jokes. I am a 16-year-old non-binary MUNer who does everything in their ability to make people happy. That's it.
Well, good for you. So I would use two places to answer your question, Timbuktu and the United States. They may not seem that similar, but they actually are. Timbuktu was a great center of civilization in the Renaissance period, really on a par with Italy during the Renaissance, which is something I used to study and teach, Renaissance art. People came to Timbuktu from all over Africa, the Middle East, and even some from Europe. It was a great center of scholarship. And what remains from that time are the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts written on every topic you can think of. And these manuscripts, they could have been written by Leonardo da Vinci. Very much the same spirit of inquiry and curiosity and exploration. They're about scientific matters, they're about good governance, tolerance, plurality. They talk about the importance of embracing and tolerating different kinds of people and the importance of a ruler. And it was an Islamic society, so it would be a ruler who is ruling according to the general, not strict ideas of Islam, of a ruler not imposing one way of being on the people in the region, but rather allowing diversity to flourish. And it was indeed that diversity and plurality that was the strength of Timbuktu. And the same, I so strongly believe, is true of the United States. And we were taken, I see the grimace, Josne, so you'll have to explain that to me. We were taken down a terrible path by our last president, who evoked something that was never true. And this is something that leaders who sow division do. It's happening in England now with Brexit. It's happening in India now with Modi suggesting this golden Hindu era. And it happened with Donald Trump with this idea of make America great again. Well, great like what? Great when? You know, great when we had no civil rights legislation, great when we had slavery, great when we were massacring the Native Americans. When exactly was this great period. You know, maybe at the end of World War II, there might have been a great nanosecond, but you can find plenty of, you know, shameful behaviors as in World War II also, such as Franklin Roosevelt knowing about and doing nothing about the Holocaust. So the great period kind of escapes me. But I think one thing that sets the United States apart, and I will say this was, I think, a kind of a missed opportunity for our really fantastic Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in those very forward-leaning remarks to his Chinese counterparts in Alaska. I don't know if you all saw this. I really recommend looking it up. It was quite amazing. He did very vociferously, and good for him, express the United States support for human rights, and specifically called out what's going on in Xinjiang. But the opportunity he missed, and this is, I believe, a special characteristic of the United States, was the opportunity to act with humility and self-criticism. And if he had said, I'm going to mention this aspect of human rights and I'm going to criticize what's going on in China, but when I do that, I recognize the United States' own weakness on human rights and the work that the United States needs to do, which is clearer now than it's ever been, to rectify racial relations in our countries, not just between Black and white, but obviously also Asian Americans and every minority. And the United States is very imperfect and is working on this. I think if he had said that, that would have been very difficult for his Chinese counterpart to come back and say, well, who are you to talk about human rights? Which, and not surprisingly, they did. My point is, Hosni, that the United States' strength is in diversity. And God forbid that we become a homogenous what? Homogenous what? We're going to be a majority non-white population in a couple of decades. So what's homogenous? There is no homogenous in the United States, thank goodness. And our strength has always been in our diversity. And we have to really fight to get that concept back, because we may be a democracy, but leadership is really important. And 4 years of racist rhetoric from the White House has had a really devastating effect. And I'm not saying there weren't racists in America before. Of course there were. There always have been. But before Donald Trump, there was at least a sense that you don't say this stuff out loud. And when it is broadcast out loud, then people start saying it out loud themselves, and then they start acting on it. And it takes a while for this to take hold. And I think it's going to take a long time to put this monstrous genie back in the bottle. But there's no question that diversity is a strength. And culture is one of the great expressions of that diversity.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schneider, for your amazing talk and for answering all of these questions. Hopefully, all of our delegates can have another perspective now that they go into their committees. And I hope that you all know how to implement all these words that the ambassador said about culture, diversity, extremism, and knowing how to implement those in your debates and in your resolutions. With this, and I'll declare IOMUN 7 open. Thank you so much, everyone. I believe that you can now join your breakout rooms. Feel free to do so. If you are, I believe, in the World Health Organization, you may stay here. And yes, and thank you so much again, Dr. Schneider. It was truly amazing, and we're very grateful for you.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.